How's it going? Yeah, so I had this idea a couple of years ago when I was in college. I was, I think I was at the time, to recall, to pull upon my memory, what class I was in or whatever, what inspired the thought. I don't think the class was even related to the topic. I just had the idea because I was not paying attention to class where a lot of good ideas happen, um, ironically. In any case, um, I had this idea about political correctness and specifically how political correctness often manifests in restricting not only the tone used and the way that speech is conveyed, right? But often it's not about that per se. It's not really a tone thing. It's more of a how. Well, I'm getting a little bit. I'm not staying on point. How political correctness often restricts the topic of discussion, what can be discussed, and what types of things can be said. And this idea of trigger warnings and things of that nature are fine if they're only a trigger warning and they don't actually result in restricting what we can discuss, what kinds of questions we can ask, and just how much we can push the boundaries of thought and push against convention. I mean, if political correctness is just about trigger warnings and ensuring that people are courteous in debate and don't use logical fallacies and yada yada yada, then that's fine. But often what it means is restricting the types of things that we can discuss, and especially the types of questions that we can ask. It's a very FE thing, and it often becomes a conformity thing. But in any case, or at least that's how it feels, right? Whether or not people legitimately conform internally is another question. At least externally, we're forced to abide by certain norms. So in any case, yeah, and I'm not against political correctness in general. I don't think it's I don't think that being courteous with each other in a debate and being understanding of the other side and being charitable is necessarily I'm all for dialectical charity and being courteous to the other side and discursive charity and everything else. That's fine with me. What bothers me a little bit more is the idea that we simply can't ask certain questions because they would trigger too many negative feelings. Like, for instance, I took a class while in school on, where we would freely ask these types of controversial questions. And we would ask the bigger, more controversial why questions in a legitimate and substantive way. Why is murder wrong? Why is rape wrong? Why? And we'd ask these types of questions. And we'd explore, what the logic is underlying that. And, I liked that class and I never really was triggered. Maybe that's a privilege, but in any case, the thought I had was this on political correctness. If we can't even mention it, then how can we defeat it? If we can't mention it, how can we defeat it? And so in this sense, oftentimes what happens is political correctness becomes a kind of obstruction. It obstructs the progress of in my view, it can obstruct the progress of thought. It may make people more comfortable in the debate setting. It may encourage courtesy and charity with the other side and everything else, and that's all fine. But when it becomes not asking questions and not exploring why, because we're too afraid to be triggered by the analysis, I think that's an inappropriate form of political correctness. And I think that often does result, and it causes us to internalize the idea that we have to walk on eggshells when thinking, that we have to be sensitive and delicate and all these things, and that's fine, right? But not there are no such things as crimes in thought, only in action, at least as far as I believe. When we say there are crimes in thought, we're led to a dystopian reality. So we have to recognize that there's a distinction between thought and reaction, or thought and action, and that there are no crimes in thought. Therefore, there are no criminal questions. There are no unethical questions. There are no, and maybe this is just my bias toward being a free thinker and wanting people to think freely and everything, but in a utilitarian sense, it's far more valuable because thought is a kind of fail-safe. It's an error correction process by which traditions and customs and rules and institutions are scrutinized for their errors, and we can improve by encouraging that error correction process. We can eliminate error from institutions and customs and rules, and et cetera, et cetera. So ultimately, there is great utility in free thinking, even if it is somewhat disruptive and can cause some amount of disorder and inefficiency. Regardless, ultimately, the net benefit is much greater if we assume that there will be cases in which unquestioned answers are wrong and go wrong, right? So it's the idea of preferring an unanswered question to an unquestioned answer. And I believe in that very strongly. But it's the simple question about, if we can't even mention it, then how can we defeat it? And so we have to be able to explore things freely, even if they are triggering. And that's not, simply because you're triggered. I mean, you then don't engage with the debate. Then just simply don't engage with the debate. We're not obligated to, the burden is not upon us to not trigger you. The burden is upon you not to be triggered, whether or not that's just in any sense. Maybe I get that that's unfair, but there's an inherent unfairness where who do we place the burden on? The speaker or the listener to not trigger or to not be triggered or control your triggering feelings or whatever. I mean, this is all going to be very controversial and I'm going to end up triggering people in the process, whatever. I mean, I'm not saying that you should be a dick or that, you should just be mean-spirited or that, you shouldn't be charitable in a debate and courteous and valid. And I'm just saying that oftentimes the pathos of political correctness is very obstructing to discussion. And, and then certain topics are shot down and then certain people are shot down because they're not just speaking, they're not just parroting what everyone else is saying, and you have to be very charitable with people and, to persuade people, you really have to be, be very delicate and considerate of, and really, I'm not saying the burden should be on either side, but if I had to place the burden between having to control, right? So, is it my job not to trigger, or is it your job not to be triggered? And I don't think I actually have to even. That may be a false dilemma, right? And I'm totally willing to concede that. I'm engaging in the charity that I'm talking about right now. I'm trying to be politically correct about criticizing political correctness in general. But this is just my feelings. And why are expressing a feeling in a debate or a thought? Why are your feelings about what I'm saying? I'd say they're equally valid. That's what a debate is about, right? Expressing our thoughts and our feelings about things, and then competing in that way, trying to battle out, the battle of ideas. But the need to be political correct at times has to be the obligation to be politically correct is not a rule. It is a courtesy, right? It's not a requirement. It's a courtesy that we practice. It's not. I'm not required to be politically correct, but I will be, right? It's something that I choose to take on freely, and it's a courtesy rather than a requirement, right? And that's very important. So. At the same time, I'm perfectly willing to be politically, I'm trying to be as politically correct as possible in criticizing political correctness. But, it's regardless, we have to be, yeah, sure. I mean, persuasion is not just about logic. I mean, there are different forms of argumentation. Logos, pathos, and ethos, and ethos, whatever. Ethos would make more sense because we say ethics rather than ethics. So, ethos, pathos, or pathos, whatever it is. I'm not sure what the pronunciation. But in any case, we need to recognize that um, that in dilemmas where we have to choose between being fair and being smart and being logical and being true and accurate and critical and all that should be preferred to being nice. And we should be nice, but not because it's a requirement, rather because it's a courtesy to other people. And if you want to persuade people, you shouldn't adopt the approach of just not being. So I'm trying to. At one point in my life, I was far more aggressive with what I was thinking. Now I've realized that's not effective if you want to actually reach people. But at the same time, you know, it's a courtesy rather than a requirement, and we shouldn't. And really, the point is not that. The point is that we need to be able to ask we need to be able to have the freedom to offend if asking a controversial question. Um, and you know, the the right not to be offended is a direct attack on the right to think freely. And I think it's important to distinguish between those two things. And usually, what ends up happening is people taking these positions are just shot down. I'm not willing to get because it doesn't conform to some standard of political correctness. No one, luckily, on this channel, very few people are even going to watch these videos, so I don't have to worry about that calculus. But regardless, we just have gone the right way in the way that we think about debate, or we've gone the wrong way in the way that we think about debate, maybe, or many people have, not all of us. And but I courteous is being courteous and being nice and everything. Those are all great things, and they're good for persuasion and communication and reaching other people in effective ways. But if I have to choose between the two, between being accurate and being politically correct, being logically correct and being politically correct, then the latter should be preferred. Um, but I am hypocritical when I say that because I'm adopting an attitude of political correctness and criticizing it, and which I've said, but it's just a wonky issue, and I think the question is enough. If we can't mention it, how can we defeat it? Is the core utilitarian question that we should be asking when considering the value of political correctness? Absolutely, whether it's an absolute value or a relative one, whether it's a requirement or merely a courtesy, whether we should choose between thinking freely or not being offensive. These are important dilemmas and these aren't hypothetical dilemmas. These are very real world dilemmas that we face all the time when having conversations, even private conversations, even non-debate conversations. Swarm these types of dilemmas because you're always wondering. This is why I absolutely can't stand it. This is the NTP channel, so other NTPs will relate, right? Our FE is inferior, and that is the best word for it because we don't really have. The point is the problem that so with FE it's very difficult because often FE and TI will conflict with each other, and uh, and it just makes for it makes for a divided mind when you're trying to consider norms and other people's reactions to things, and then also trying to apply logic to situations, which oftentimes requires us to negate norms and requires us to defy traditions and customary rules and institutions. And so I feel that conflict pretty much all the time. And I'm not exactly sure how to manage it. I either, depending on my mood, I'll completely disregard FE and then just say whatever regardless, or I will adopt more of a conciliatory attitude toward other people's opinions, and that try to work within that frame and try to figure out um, how best to conduct myself. But that is secondary to whether I'm being accurate and being right, or and not even just being accurate, being honest. So it's very interesting that what is a higher value, honesty or politeness? Well, if we have to choose between the two, it's certainly honesty, right? I mean, and we should be firm in choosing honesty when we have to choose between politeness and honesty. And when we have to choose, on the other hand, right, you can be both. That's the thing. Okay, see, this is the thing. Oftentimes, I'm framing it in terms of a false dilemma, right? Sometimes the dilemma is true between honesty and politeness, right? If I have to sacrifice one, I'm choosing honesty. Oftentimes, you don't, though. You can be both polite and honest, and that's a very important note. Is often these debates about political correctness devolve into false dilemmas where it's, oh, I can't think because you know you don't want to be offended. Um, And, so ultimately the discussion comes from a place of a false dilemma, whereas you can be both, right? I mean, you can be honest and you can be polite. And oftentimes you never have to, practically speaking, right? It's only, maybe the dilemma is only theoretical because oftentimes, but, right, sometimes the content of what you're saying would be impolite inherently. Thus, you have to make the choice between the two. And so, but when we have to do that, it's navigating a very difficult issue in our daily lives because we are we exist within a society, and so to survive there is a certain amount of wagering you have to do and a certain amount of inauthenticity you have to engage in to survive within society, um, which sucks. In today's world, it's caught on that we should prefer authenticity to uh, we should prefer authenticity to yeah, I mean, if being authentic causes conflict, well, then we should just choose to be authentic anyway. I mean, yeah, sure, right? I mean, it's easy to say that, right? It's very easy to say that, harder to act on it. Often it's not advantageous to do so either, right? Sometimes it's far better to be a pacifist when dealing with conflict and deflect and try to deflate tension and everything. That's far more advantageous. You don't care about the conflict. Some people do enjoy the conflict um, for whatever reason. I don't get that. If it can be avoided, I mean, we probably should just. But at the same time, conflict is necessary. Is all I'm saying, and to accept that it's necessary, and then to engage in it when it is necessary. We should do that forthrightly. But you know, easier said than done, of course. So I don't know, but yeah, if we can't mention it, then we can't defeat. Um, and so the progress of thought on a given issue and of reform requires a certain amount of willingness to offend and uh, it shouldn't constrain the questions we ask, the things that we talk about. And sometimes political correctness can devolve into absolute injustice too. I mean, for the instance, I'm thinking about an example of, let's say, oftentimes what happens is, let's say that with the Brett Kavanaugh scandal, for instance, whatever your feelings on whether he assaulted the woman or not, political correctness, if taken to too far an extreme, right, in that instance, which is the rule is to believe the woman when she makes the accusation. Since the rule may have been that people trusted the man by default, so they're trying to switch a default setting, trusting the woman instead. We shouldn't trust either party inherently. That's the retarded. I mean, sorry, using that word is politically incorrect too. But regardless, it's just we shouldn't trust any party, by default. We should not have any impulse to trust any party by default to begin with. It should be consider the evidence, consider the nature of the accusation, consider the circumstances, and then render a judgment on whether one party should be trusted or not. Trust isn't given by default, right? It's earned. So, with the issue of that particular scandal, the political correctness says we should trust her by default. Well, if everyone goes to that side, to too far an extreme, they don't consider that there may be legitimate evidence that he did not do it, or that she's not telling the truth, or whatever, which I doubt. She probably was. She wouldn't. Right? I mean, who's going to come forward unless you're histrionic, or you're a narcissist, or a psychopath, or you're just politically motivated against conservative, nominees. Yeah, probably she's not. She believes what she's saying. She believes it happened. She believes he was the one that did it and everything else. And, if she believes that, and they've had prior relationships with each other, and, then if she truly believes it, and there's no doubt in her mind about it, and they had a prior relationship with each other, and, well, I mean, there's a lot of other confounding factors. They've both been drinking. So I mean, but again, even alcohol does not really impair your ability to remember a traumatic event like that, like assault. I mean, making a mistake about who that was. I mean, that's unlikely. It's unlikely that she could even make that mistake while impaired, while inebriated. So, probably believes, and something definitely went down, because a lot of people came forward on him and said similar things, that he was just a general creep, and So, I mean, something probably happened, some indiscretion on his part, just based on the number of people that came forward, and the obvious strength in their belief that it happened, and everything else. And so, but it's happened before. I mean, it could be a political, and this is conspiratorial, but it could be some sort of political move. She could have been paid to do it. It's certainly possible. I mean, you never know. There's this shadow government that may operate behind the scenes, and if she's paid enough, she's going to do it. If she's morally flexible, she could be a pawn of some kind, and you never know, because the same thing happened with Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas in the '80s, and so I mean, the fact that this happened on two independent occasions, in very much the same way, and under very much the same Supreme Court nomination, both Supreme Court nominations. I mean, it's interesting, and I'm not a conspiratorial person, so I wouldn't really think that that's particularly a good explanation for what's going on. But and then he's confirmed anyway. I mean, when there's any question about the character of someone, but then again, right, political correctness taken to too far an extreme, he could just be a decent person, and they're slandering him, and so the possibility of slander is totally, is there. And maybe not the possibility of slander if we assume that she believed what she said. That's not slander. That's just testimony from her perspective. The question is why wouldn't it be true if she's not lying about it? So she believes it happened. She truly believes it happened. And she has the capacity to identify who assaulted her. Well, then why should we distrust her? I mean, but who knows? In any case, that's an example of when political correctness can be taken too far. I mean, we have to be objective when it comes to any accusation, especially something that could totally destroy a person's reputation and future, right? So, I mean, we have to be skeptical about any kind of accusation like that, whether or not there's been a historical trend of believing men over women. I mean, yes, that is a problem. But here's the thing with that, right? The problem with that is saying, why is it okay? So, from the other side, they'd say, trusting men by default is a bad thing when there's a rape accusation. Okay, that's fine. Yes, everyone would agree with that. No one in their right mind would say that men should be trusted, or that it's bad to trust them by default. No one would question that, right? However, why is it then valid to trust a woman by default? So, I mean, this goes both ways. There's a contradiction there in saying, oh, it's bad to trust a man by default, and that with an accusation like that. So then why is it right to trust a woman by default? I mean, it seems to contradict itself on its face. So, you know, and that's saying nothing controversial. You'd have to agree with that. I think that's almost an inarguable statement. We wouldn't even need to debate that. There's an equivalent error there, regardless of history. So, and it's hypocrisy. It's not only a contradiction, it's extremely hypocritical. So, I mean, but the thing is, questioning this itself becomes politically incorrect, right? And then the other side, once you start questioning, it's like, oh, this guy's an anti-feminist and a misogynist, and all these were, which is absurd, but that's a totally legitimate question. If it is wrong to trust a man by default in a rape accusation, would it not be equivalently wrong to trust a woman by default? So there's a basic contradiction there that has to be acknowledged, and if it is acknowledged, it can't be argued against, which is why you use political correctness to stop the question from being asked in the first place. It's a way for perspectives and opinions to insulate themselves from criticism, and when people begin to use political correctness and exploit other people's courtesy to insulate their own opinions from critical scrutiny, that's when it becomes a problem, right? So, like I said, critical thinking is an error correction mechanism. It has a lot of utility, right? Yeah, it can cause disorder in the short term. In the long term, ultimately, we fare better if we're critical of things rather than blindly accepting of them. So, political correctness becomes a way to insulate your opinions from scrutiny, or it can be. Thinking strategically in a social situation, parties could do that. And that isn't even a leap. That's anyone who understands the strategy there would realize it's a possibility for them to do that, right? So no perspective, no rule, no norm, should be insulated from scrutiny, right? Not even the statement that nothing should be insulated from scrutiny, right? So, this is the problem with all of this, and it's a real problem. And it's not even, maybe it doesn't play out as a problem in the real world. That's not the point, right? I mean, something can be an error, right? Something can be wrong, or something can be a problem, whether or not history shows that it is. Because it may be the case that other factors, right, cushioned the error so that it never manifested in an actual historical issue. Just because history, not every lesson can be learned from history, because not every possible eventuality has played out. So history is a guide. It is not the ultimate source of truth. It is only a guide to it. It is not a source of truth. It is a guide to truth. And the future and the past, right, things are variable. And just because political correctness may not manifest negatively in the ways that I describe according to history, which they already do, I've just given an example of one, in the case of a rape accusation. So, I don't even have to make that point. The point is, if we can anticipate, Murphy's Law tells us what can happen will happen. So if there's any danger there of something, we should recognize that danger and understand that if things continue along their present course, there may be an issue. So, but I just don't understand. I don't understand I understand it, and that's why I disagree with it. And so, the impulse to insulate one's views, or I understand. We people, don't like being questioned, and people that would question end up just automatically being disliked. So, protecting against, think about how authority, especially nefarious authority, can use political correctness to insulate itself from criticism, right? Not through thought control or anything like that. But you see, it ultimately becomes very much the same thing, right, as outright thought control, because you create, if not formal laws that restrict certain thoughts and opinions and expressions, you create an informal system of norms that then inhibits thoughts that would threaten your authority. So it becomes, if not a formal legal form of thought control, it becomes an informal system which could achieve the same effect. Luckily, people aren't so afraid of their endangerment to their reputation that they're willing to transcend the calculus that would then cause them to not express a controversial point or question or criticism. So I don't know. I don't think any of this happens to be particularly conservative or liberal. I think I'm trying to come from a place of logos where there isn't so much room for debate. But of course, maybe I'm not considering this from all angles, and I would gladly take comments on my thoughts on this because I could not be considering something. In any case, that's really the only point that I wanted to make, and to ask a simple question. If we cannot, if we can't question it, or if we can't mention it, then how do we defeat it? Is there anything else? No, that's it. All right. Thank you for watching.